Hello and welcome to EDHREC's Upping the Average, where we take a commander's average deck list as compiled by the data on EDHREC and make some quick swaps to it to help take it from a good start to a great one. This week, I wish you nothing but the best. Live long and prosper. Tome-Bound has, as of this week, officially become the #1 most popular Rakdos commander, and it's no mystery why. He's a card advantage and mana producing machine. He blocks efficiently with Death Touch, puts cards away into exile every end step, and every time we do play a card from exile, including lands from exile, he gives us treasure tokens. What a terrific, terrific value engine. Prosper's EDHREC page is a wild assortment of exile-based card advantage, which is often called impulse draw. Some will even let us exile and play cards from enemy libraries, giving us tons of extra trickery. However, the most notable cards here are definitely the treasure payoff cards, but we'll get to those in a minute. For now, let's get Prosper's average list from the average deck feature and import it to the Architect deck building website. As always, any swaps we make must either keep the total price of the deck cost neutral or else help lower the overall cost of the deck. I gotta give props to Prosper's proper prospects. He is indeed prospering, flourishing, and outright luxuriating in a mountain of value here. If this is where your deck is starting, you're gonna do extremely well for yourself. Rakdos strategies have often been associated with a swingy or explosive playstyle, but Prosper is a king of efficiency and consistency, stocking up tons of treasure for bigger and bigger plays. Real quick, let's get to know the key cards in this deck. First and foremost are various impulse draw effects. There are some classic one-shot versions of this, like Ignite the Future and Jeska's Will, but we have lots of consistent impulse draw effects too, from Outpost Siege to Chandra. A lot of our creatures help out here too. Lelia gives us more cards and gets bigger for them, and Dream Devourer lets us cast basically anything from exile by foretelling it from our hand. Special shout out too to two double face cards here, by the way. Birgi and Valki are masterful on their back halves, Horn of Harnfell and Tybalt Cosmic Imposter, which both put so many cards into exile that we will be Scrooge McDucking our way through a veritable vault of treasure tokens. Tybalt's not the only one that nabs cards from our enemies either. Itali will bash into the red zone, cast free stuff, and will gain mana for doing it, which is crazy pants. And I'm happy to see Ubamask make it into Prosper's average deck too, because it turns all draw into impulse draw, which can restrict our opponents from casting harmful instant spells, and which we will get more value out of than any other player. Oh, but we're not done. Even our removal spells participate in the exile synergy. Some can be cast from exile, and some can shut down enemies while stealing from them. Little effects from Foretell to Cascade can all produce incidental treasure, and it all adds up. The most important part of Prosper's deck, however, is how he makes use of all those treasure tokens. Prosper's all-star card is definitely Academy Manufactor, which triples up his artifact production. One of the coolest cards to come out of 2021. Manipulating treasure tokens is our key to victory. Marionette Master and friends help turn all those treasure tokens into lethal damage. Nadir's Nightblade doesn't just count creature tokens. It drains for any token, making it another huge powerhouse here. All that sacrificed treasure can add up into tons and tons of pings to knock out our opponents with death by 1,000 cuts. Or we can, of course, secure a victory with a well-timed revel in riches. So yeah, there's a lot happening here. And now that we have our bearings, where can we make improvements? We'll tackle this list in 3 basic but important ways: card advantage, removal spells, and proper payoffs. Let's start off by looking closely at our card advantage. One of the most important lessons to learn in Magic is that there's a big difference between card draw and card advantage. Prosper rides that line in a fascinating way. We're going to start off simple. Our commander provides card advantage, so we don't have to worry too much about getting a bunch more of it in the 99. But I do reckon we can sand off some edges here. Oracle's Vault is a decent engine for impulse draw, but it costs a lot of mana to deploy in the first place. It gets better over time, but we have a lot of other consistent impulse draw cards here already too. And plus, I see that new Reckless Impulse card from Crimson Vow, and I just want to swap that in here ASAP. It's effectively another version of Light Up the Stage, and I like getting those little burst effects interspersed with our other forms of card advantage. I don't know, maybe I'm just following a Reckless Impulse of my own. Speaking of which, I really like Deadly Dispute when I tried it. Sacrifice a treasure, draw 2 cards, and make another treasure? That's hilarious! And again, I like diversifying our advantage. Some burst, some consistent exile effects, and some genuine card draw, so that not all of our advantage has timing restrictions. This thing has just been funny every single time that I see it. I love that it refunds itself. However, to add, we must make cuts, and I'm actually going to make a few extra cuts here to make room for some spicy stuff in later categories. Chaos Wand is funny, but it's a lot of mana for an unreliable payoff. Sometimes you end up with a rinky-dink ramp spell that was definitely not worth all of that mana. And sometimes you wind up with a counterspell, which just completely whiffs. So sorry, Chaos Wand, but we're gonna need you to Chaos Wander away. Next, I'm actually gonna be a bit of a Grinch and cut the Tectonic Giant. I like this card, honestly I do, but I found this deck likes to cycle through things pretty quickly, and that waiting to untap and attack was not always reliable. The Summoning Sickness really holds them back here, and the Giant needs to have a safe attack step to get repeatable advantage anyway, so over time, I just realized that I was falling out of love with it. Plus, spoiler alert, I want to get more win conditions into this deck, so I'm making a few more cuts to get some extra room here. Speaking of extra room, I think we need an extra land. 32 lands is a low count. I don't think this is a sensible number for just any deck out there. However, to be clear, I think Prosper can actually get away with a low land count. He makes a lot of treasures, and he helps us dig for more lands in the first place too. He's perfectly set up to accommodate a low land count deck, but I would personally just feel safer with having one more. I'm going to add in a card that, bafflingly, players are removing from Prosper's original precon. Zhalfirin Void is actually really good here. ETB, Scry 1, it helps us see whether we like the card that Prosper will put into exile at the end of the turn. In fact, I'm going to take this here Foreboding Ruins and swap it for a Temple of Malice too. Foreboding Ruins comes into play tapped a lot of the time anyway, and I like scrying to see whether Prosper is going to exile something juicy or not. I just think it's good value. And actually, I'm going to make one more swap here too. I'm going to exchange a basic land for a Guildless Commons. It might just be a me thing, but I like bounce lands a lot, especially in decks with low land counts. We have to make sure that we get enough lands to cast our commander in the first place, and bounce lands really help secure land drops even when we don't have a lot of lands to draw. Alright, with that said, I'm going to make one more expensive cut in this section. Praetor's Grasp. It is a cheap card to cast, but it is a pretty pricey card these days. And the thing is, I don't know if I'm convinced it's worth the cost. Go find one player's best card and later you can cast it. Our treasures can help us cast whatever it is, which is nice, but I didn't feel like this was the right place to put money when upgrading this deck, especially since other players' best cards might not necessarily be the best card that our deck needs. Praetor's Grasp helps dismantle combo decks, I suppose, but there are just other cards that I think we should spend our upgrade money on that will have a much bigger impact than this one. Alright, that'll move us along. Our card advantage is important, but so is our removal. Usually the removal you'll see from deck to deck to deck in EDH is your typical Swords to Plowshares, Infernal Grasp, generally useful but non-specific fare. The cool thing about Prosper is that even our removal in this deck can be made to fit into our overall exile-y game plan. So, believe me, I love Bituminous Blast. I played Jund back in the day. Cascading off of this thing is funny. But I don't love Bituminous Blast here. If we're going to pay 5 mana to cascade and deal damage, we're going to make it spicy. Volcanic Torrent also cascades, giving us a treasure, and the cascaded spell resolves before the torrent does. So, for a minimum, this is dealing 2 damage to start. Not incredible on its own, although for the record, that is some anti-token tech that I think our deck needs pretty badly. But again, that's the minimum. We get a lot of mana in this deck. Like, a lot. Treasures abound. We're casting multiple spells pretty dang often. So Torrent is often a Bituminous Blast that scales up and hits all our opponent's creatures. And their planeswalkers. Fun stuff. And you know what? A 5 mana area of effect spell that hits a bunch of our opponent's stuff is reminding me a lot of Vandal Blast. No, I'm not cutting Vandal Blast. I'm just noticing a lot of wonderful ways to kill artifacts in this deck. And that makes me eager to invite a Liquimetal Torque to the festivities. Red-Black can struggle with killing enchantments, but Liquimetal Torque gives us a great tool to take down pesky enemy permanents. And even better, it's a great 2-mana rock to help us land Prosper on turn 3. By the by, I spy one pair of shoes in this list, but not the other. Let's get Swiftfoot Boots in here. Prosper can draw a lot of attention to himself, so I think an extra form of protection will be nice. Plus, it's cool to have another haste enabler for cards like Atali, too. My final swap in this section sadly comes to us in the form of Consuming Vapors. I actually do like this card, but it's clunky. Sacrifice effects can be devastating against the right opponent, but they can also be total duds, and at 4 mana, even with Rebound, this one definitely has a fail state. It's okay though, I promise the card that I'm swapping it for is really exciting. Y'all ever put a Viridian Longbow on a commander that has natural death touch? Ping a critter whenever you want and poof, it's gone? Repeatable removal that'll keep us safe, which gives us leeway to make deals with players if we're so inclined, and which will totally catch unwitting enemies off guard? This is incredible. Get it into your deck ASAP. Okay, feeling good? Good, because now it's time for the big one. I've said it before and I'll say it again. Value isn't victory. We need to make sure that our deck isn't just spinning its wheels and that our payoffs are operating at 100% capacity without potentially tripping over themselves. I've got 4 cuts that I need to make in this section, and I think at first they might look a little egregious, but they all have one very big thing in common. I'm cutting Profane Tutor, Fevered Suspicions, Apex of Power, and Soul Talisman. Yes, all 4 of these. Every single one of them has cool synergy with Prosper. There is no doubt about that. The problem is that they also have anti-synergy with Prosper too. If these cards end up in exile off of one of our Impulse Draw effects or off of Prosper himself, then they get a lot worse. Apex of Power doesn't refund itself when cast from exile, for example, making it expensive and unable to help us go off on the big turn like it wants us to. Fevered Suspicions, like consuming vapors before it, doesn't trigger rebound if we cast it from exile. And as for the other 2, if they get put into exile off of our Impulse Draw, they'll just stay there forever because we can only suspend cards when they're in our hand. These look like small problems, but when they come up in actual gameplay, they're really harsh non-bows. The overwhelming majority of our card advantage is based upon exile, and these cards get worse if we find them while doing the thing that our deck wants us to do. I'd like to chop them to make room for proper payoffs, ones that will take our commander's ability and make it lethal, because that is the biggest conundrum of Prosper players, how to take all this treasure and turn it from value into victory. We have some helpers in the deck already, but some of them ping opponents just one at a time, so we need extra firepower. I'm going to start off with Cut to Ribbons. This doesn't look like much, but it's sneaky good in this deck. The first part is a simple damage spell, nothing to really write home about, and the second half is a mana sink that can turn a mountain of treasure into a game ender. There are tons of big mana sink X spells out there though, so why this specific one? What makes Cut to Ribbons so special? Well, if we played another X spell, for one thing, we have cascade effects in this deck, so that would be kind of a non-bow if we cascade into an X spell for 0. But for another thing, X spells get stranded with Impulse Draw. If we happen to exile some big X spell early on in the game, but don't need to cast it yet, well, then Cut to Ribbons, though, is different. If we happen to exile it early on and we don't need to cast the Ribbons half yet, then we can still cast the cheap front half to get the card into the graveyard, where we can aftermath it later, once we've built up a true mountain of treasure. Super budget, synergistic win-con card? Yeah, sign me up. And to help with this mountain of treasure, I'd like to add in Inspiring Statuary, which gives all of our non-artifact spells improvise, which basically means that our artifacts can tap for mana. This thing's amazing in equipment decks, but I also love it here. In fact, my co-hosts on the EDH Recast have specifically brought this card to my attention for Prosper decks. The treasures we're making already tap for mana, but this card can help them tap for mana and still stick around for later. We can just bank the tokens every turn and build up a huge pile of them. That way, when the Marionette Master finally comes down on a later turn, we will have a devastating pile of gold ready and waiting to funnel into that ability. And finally, this card is gross, which means we've gotta have it. Bolas's Citadel. No, really, this thing's disgusting, especially in a deck with as few lands as this one. But the reason I'm specifically recommending it here is because Prosper makes just a bazillion permanents. This is one of the few decks where I've seen Bolas's Citadel use that 10 life chunk effect multiple times without breaking a sweat. We want to turn our treasures lethal? This will do it in spades, and all while maintaining a sweet, sweet value engine. Alright, that's it for cuts, but before we officially wrap up, let's finish with some honorable mentions. If you're playing this deck on a tighter budget, what are some other options out there for you? This deck contains some really expensive cards after all. Dockside alone is like a fifth of the budget. You can easily save over $150 on this deck if you just ignore the 5 most expensive cards. Treasure Makers do not need to cost you the actual price of gold. And as nice as these supplemental helpers are, Prosper doesn't need them to be bonkers good. So for replacements, or other cards to look into, these 3 budget-friendly cards are all pretty good at making our treasures even more of a problem for enemy life totals. We sacrifice a whole lot of stuff in this deck, and any one of these looks really scary with a bunch of gold behind them. But just imagine if you get multiple of them out at once. I also think it could be worthwhile to look into Idol of Oblivion. Like I said, we make a lot of treasure, and this is a neat way to double up on the card advantage. Oh, and if you want to be especially crazy, you can also try out Possibility Storm here. Though I should warn you, I think the cost on this card is social capital rather than actual capital. Since Prosper plays so much stuff from exile, he delights in the chaos, and some of the cards he's casting are also immune to its effects, so it's really one-sided and very devastating. I'd say to check with your group if this is the kind of thing they'll be cool with, and if they are, it's a cheap card that will do a whole lot of work for you. Continuing our honorable mentions, what about the inverse? What if you're splurging on this deck to make Prosper's 99 even more luxuriant? Well, in that case, I think we lose some of the funnier cards in the list. Cards that I honestly do kind of love, but which are admittedly unreliable. I noticed that some of the higher-end Prosper decks even end up cutting Disrupt Decorum too, because things get really efficient at the top end for Prosper sometimes. For example, some players will turn to Storm strategies with Aetherflux Reservoir, which pays off in huge dividends since Prosper can churn through so many spells in a single turn. Sensei's Divining Top also helps manipulate the exiled cards, and it also has a crazy combo with the Citadel that I added in earlier. But, at the same time, there are probably a lot of combos that you can unlock at this stage once you put your mind to it. For more careful focus, I think Imperial Recruiter or some such creature tutor could be useful to help find key creatures in the deck, the Marionette or the Manufactor, for example, to make sure that the deck can accrue value when it needs to and find its win conditions in a timely fashion. And, of course, in any deck with a herkin' huge tank of artifact tokens, Krark Clan Ironworks starts to get real spicy. The final thing I'll shout out is the mana base. First, Treasure Vault is a very fun inclusion if you can afford it, both in money and mana. Surprise treasures right before a Revel in Riches is really cool. And if you're splurging on this deck, I recommend a swap to Snowlands, because Draugr Necromancer can steal from enemies with the assistance of snow mana. If it weren't for the cumulative cost of Snowlands, this would have been an official inclusion to the main deck. Speaking as the resident Reanimator player at the table, this card is really aggravatingly tough to go against because it exiles my precious creatures. But what's worse is when the Draugr also steals those creatures, and it's salt in the wound when Prosper also makes treasure every time the Draugr Necromancer does it. I can't even be mad. It's heckin' hilarious. So definitely look for this thing too if you're upgrading. Alright, I think that'll do it. Prosper is ready to live long and, well, you know the rest. You can find a link to the list in the description below with the cuts in the maybe board. I hope you've had a most prosperous time, and if you have any other treasures that you'd like to share with your fellow Rakdos players, make sure you leave your suggestions in the comments below. Thanks so much for watching.